Welcome, everybody, to our next episode of Listen In to Conversations That Matter with Dr. Larry Crabb, brought to you by largerstory.com. I'm Crabb. Thanks for joining us today. Before we get started, I just want to take everybody through what's going to happen today and remind everyone that in the upper right-hand corner, you've got a viewing button that if you want to click, you've got some options to choose for what you want to see as you're watching today's presentation. There's also a button in the middle of the screen, right in the middle on the bottom. It's a Q&A button for questions and answers. We'd encourage you that if you have any questions or comments during today's conversation, please click on that and let us know what you're thinking. And depending upon time, we'll take some of those questions after the discussion wraps up today. So please click on that to let us know if you have any questions or comments. So let me introduce our guest today. We're excited to have a therapist. He's a speaker who helps guide men and women to outgrow unwanted sexual behavior. He's an author. He's written a book. The book is titled Unwanted: How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing. And in that book, he does some research, over 3,800 people talking about a lot of different topics. Some of the topics are lust management, how today that seems to be what a lot of counselors do, doesn't seem to be as effective. Obviously, he talks a lot about shame and how shame can be so damaging and how it really keeps us from telling the story that we really need to tell. And in telling that story, our untold story, it gives us an opportunity to have a key towards finding freedom towards some of the addictions that we're struggling with. You can get that book Unwanted on Amazon.com, and we'll promote that a little bit towards the end of the show today. But I'd like to welcome Jay Stringer. Jay, thanks for joining us today, man.
Yep, Larry, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
You know, we thought this would be really interesting because the way we kind of put it with our team here at Larger Stories, we get the old guy with the young guy talking about addiction. So I don't know if
the old guy here
in that, Jay, but we'll call you the young guy today.
And you're calling me the old guy. I appreciate that.
Well, one of the things, Jay, as we get started, and I'll let you and Dad take off here, but one of the things that we were really excited about was your whole notion of story and how it is important to unpack what we like to call our smaller story, which is really our birth to our death. And and we're living in the larger story, which is really the cross to the coming. And what is our role in the larger story? And unpacking that seems to really be something that you keyed on and seems to be really important in regards to some of the messaging that you're talking about. If you want to unpack a little bit of that, I'll let you and Dad get started here. Thanks.
Sure.
Well, Jay, I'm really glad you're part of it, Jay. I really am. And I'm very eager to unpack a little more. I have not read your book, and I intend to, but I think I have a beginning understanding of it, and I really want to hear what you're talking about.
Sure.
So if you can just unpack some of the basic essentials that you understand to be really helpful in overcoming sexual addiction, I'd love to listen for a while.
Sure. I think to Kep's point, I think where I would begin is this notion of story for me really got solidified when I was in grad school. I remembered I have both my grandfather's names, Jay and Elmer. Jay died a couple years before I was born, and Elmer died when I was in grad school. And I'm not sure if you've ever been at a funeral like this, but my grandfather was a revered man, World War II survivor, one of the first missionaries into Albania, but I didn't really know much of his life. And so I remember flying back from Florida to Seattle and just having this kind of ache of like, I don't know much about my story, my family story. And so I made this kind of commitment to really get to know my grandmother, whose name was Dorothy. And it's a longer story, but to shorten it here would just be that she moved from Chattanooga, Tennessee out to Seattle, Washington because of some health issues. And for, a woman with Southern sensibilities, she did not want to be in Seattle whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
So I took her out on her 90th birthday. And before I went out to brunch with her, I went to this antique store and I bought 3 skeleton keys from the era of my grandmother's birth year. And I said, Grandma, these 3 keys symbolize 3 lunches that I want to take you out to learn more about your life. And, I'm thinking this is the best grandson gift of all time. What could be better? And my grandmother looked completely horrified. It was like I just asked for her inheritance. And she said something that changed my life that day. She said, Jay, there are some stories you just don't tell. There are some doors you just don't open. And she pushed that box back across the table. And that was our last meaningful conversation before she died. And so for me, that was just this really amazing insight into the way that most people live with regard to their stories. Is there's a lot of shame. There's a lot of untold stories in each of us. And those untold stories really hijack and create impasses around our ability to live into the larger story that your ministry talks so beautifully about. And so a lot of, the conviction to write this book, Unwanted, was to really say there are so many untold stories of men and women out there. And when you begin to talk about sexual brokenness, really anywhere in the world, what normally comes up are basically two main paradigms. We have the lust management paradigm and then the shame management paradigm. And the lust management paradigm is basically what you know really well if you've grown up in any Christian community. This is bounce your eyes when you're having an inappropriate thought. Some people slap rubber bands around their wrist when they're having a sexual temptation. Internet monitoring, putting some technology on your devices to block it. But as one of my friends said to me when I was writing my book, he said, Jay, when I have been having the same conversation with my accountability partner for 15 years, something isn't working. Within that, there's also what I would say is just shame management. And I would say this is more of a progressive idea, but the main issue is that shame and stigma are our primary issues. And if we could just remove the shame and stigma associated with our sexual choices, then people would be liberated and would be able to get on with their lives. Well, it turns out that both paradigms actually don't lead to freedom. And so the approach that I took within Unwanted was really trying to carve out a third way of how do we invite men and women who are struggling to really make meaning out of their sexual life. And so one of the things that my team decided to do was we did some research on nearly 3,800 men and women. So we wanted to get a sense of what was their story that they were bringing into their sexual brokenness. So we asked about their mothers and fathers. We asked about past sexual abuse, bullying, difficulties in their present day life. Like, did they have a lot of lack of purpose in their careers? Were they dealing with a lot of shame? And then we asked a very counterintuitive question. We actually asked people to tell us about their sexual fantasies, like when they're having sex with their spouse, or what are the predominant porn searches that they keep going back to. So we put all of that into basically the research instrument. And then I had a team at New York University handle all the analytics. And what we found is, I think, quite fascinating. It's that unwanted sexual behavior, the use of pornography, infidelity, hookups, none of that is random. It's actually a direct reflection of the parts of our story that haven't been addressed. And so the implication of my book, I think, is really important. It means that our sexual brokenness is not a life sentence to addiction or to shame. It's actually a roadmap to healing. And so that's, just to intro the book and some of the concepts around story, that's what we were looking at is, could someone's sexual brokenness be predicted and shaped based on the unresolved parts of their story? And sure enough, it can be.
Well, that's a pretty good summary of the whole thing. And I presume not only lust management is ineffective and shame management is ineffective, but behavioral management doesn't do any better either.
No.
Gripping the white knuckle approach to, I'm not going to do it. I promise God, I won't do it again. So say more about what kind of a story needs to reveal the roadmap to healing. Tell me how that works.
Yeah, so I mean, if we were to start at a very basic level, there's a French psychoanalyst by the name of Lacan, and for Lacan, the symptom is the solution. And so, let's say, Larry, I have like a really bad back. My bad back is a symptom. It's trying to get my attention, and so there's a couple ways that I could cope with my bad back. I could drink a gin and tonic. I could down ibuprofen all throughout the day,
That sounds good.
yeah, or I could begin to kind of ask what's going on with my bad back. And so for Lacan, he uses this really fascinating kind of wordplay between symptom and saint home. So in the French word for symptom, if I'm pronouncing that right, is symptom. But the word in French, the phrase in French for prophet is saint home. And so what Lacan says is that our symptoms are actually holy prophets. They are prophets, they are teachers that are trying to get our attention in the only way that they know how. And so I think that's really true of our addictions and our sexual brokenness, is that they are symptoms. They are trying to get our attention. But most of us try lust management. You know, we white knuckle it, as you said. We try to basically just engage in what I refer to as just an evangelical binge and purge cycle with sexual addiction, where we binge, we feel sorry, we pray, we listen to worship music, and then we ask God to get rid of it. And it's just this endless binge and purge cycle. And so the approach that I'm taking in Unwanted is, what if we actually interrogated our sexual fantasies? What if we listened to our lust? And so some of the research that we found was that, let's say that you were a man struggling with a lack of purpose in your life, meaning you don't really like your career, you don't know where your life is going, you look back at your life and see a lot of failure. Well, that man was 7 times more likely to pursue more unwanted sexual behavior. Or let's say that you were someone who was heavily involved in pornography. We found that we used a Likert scale of 0 to 5. And so we found that those who answered 5s with regard to their use in pornography, we found that their sexual abuse scores were nearly 24% higher than those who did not view pornography at all. And so I think if we're paying attention to our symptoms and to our brokenness, that brokenness can actually be a roadmap to healing. But I think what's happening in most Christian communities is that we intuitively know we're not supposed to be addicted to something outside of holiness. We know that we're not supposed to, allow our hearts to merge with something less than the glory that God would have for us. And so we know it in our bones, but we keep going back to it. And so I think part of what ends up happening is we try to suppress those thoughts. We try and pursue godliness, but it doesn't really work. And I think that this is the point of the incarnation, is that when God takes on flesh, God moves into the neighborhood. He identifies with humanity, and as much as it's broken and as much as it's ill. And that's where we are to look for the arrival of God in our lives, is in the geography of addiction. It's in the geography of our heartache. And so I think that's what I'm, really trying to invite people into, is that your brokenness is actually a doorway into the wider work of healing that the God of the universe deeply wants for us.
And tell me again how that works. Here I am. Let's suppose I come to you and tell you I've got homosexual desires. And when my wife is not looking, I turn to the porn at 2 a.m. and enjoy myself a little bit. Tell me what you say to me. Give me a feel for, this is more than an insight model, I think. There's a lot of insight going on here, but I gather there's some powerful insights, there's some redeeming understandings, but I'm not sure I quite get it yet. So help me understand what I need to do to actually get the roadmap toward healing by listening to what the problem is.
Yeah. So, I think if we were to look at just a lot of family systems, Dr. Patrick Carnes's work looked at basically what's the profile of someone who struggles with sexual addiction. And what he found is that these families ended up being highly rigid or highly disengaged. And so what ends up happening in a very rigid home is that you have a mother, a father, a system that's ruling with a lot of rigidity, a lot of kind of the iron fist. And so they might use shame. They might use kind of religious conformity in order to bend your will. Well, what ends up happening is that hypocrisy and the harm in that family system has to go somewhere. And so for some people, unwanted sexual behavior, pornography becomes one of the first places where they can actually have something of what they want outside of the tyranny of their family system. Or let's say you grew up in a very disengaged family system. And so, the way that I think about that is like, if you were in middle school and you had a really difficult day, did your mother, did your father see you? So did they notice that there was a change in your face? Well, if we don't have attunement in our life, if we don't have, the people that God put on earth to see us, to pursue us, we're going to have to take some of those longings for connection somewhere else. And so for a lot of people, especially as they go through puberty, unwanted sexual behavior is one of the first places that they begin to find connection. And so part of the healing journey for them is to recognize that in pornography or in kind of going after their spouse goes to bed and they go and get connection met in that way, part of what they need to identify is that is actually a very old pattern. That's something that in the absence of care, in the absence of recognizing some of the heartache in their life, they learned how to take a shortcut to sexual brokenness. And so I think this is where, Matthew 5:4 comes in of blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. There's a lot of us who are seeking unwanted sexual behavior and sexual brokenness initially as a type of comfort. But it's a surrogate, it's a counterfeit form of it. And so I think our addictions are always inviting us back to formative places of pain, and to recognize that that's where the healing journey needs to begin.
I didn't hear you use the phrase self-medication. Does that fit what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that becomes a very, I would just say that's a normative, that's a baseline way that most of us, get through life. So, I don't know how your 2020 has been, Larry, but 2020 has been a rough year on so many people. And so just that sense of our hygiene is off. A lot of times people's drinking is up, their involvement with Netflix. So just that sense of we are a nation who has been through a lot of trauma, a lot of fragmentation, so much scapegoating. And so in the midst of all that trauma, in the midst of all that heartache, we begin to, in your book, Waiting for Heaven, you talk about what does it mean to wait? What does it mean to kind of live with an ache, a thirst for something eternal? But most of us don't know how to wait. We don't wait very well. We take a lot of shortcuts. And so I think that our shortcuts are always challenging us and inviting us to consider the people that we're becoming. And I think that's the danger of kind of the ubiquity of porn and sexual brokenness in the world today, is that it becomes one of the most immediate and available sources of counterfeit pleasure and self-medicating in our life.
And it's difficult sometimes to get any other pleasure that rises above the pleasure of sexual addiction. I'm taken by, there's an old writer in 1895, I think, who talked about we live in the exhaustion of unsatisfied desire. Yes. And we're so badly wanting something fulfilling within us. And then you talk about one of the old Puritans, Thomas Chalmers, who said that we can live in the expulsive power of a new affection. And rather than claiming the affection I have for the self-medicating power of pleasure for looking at porn, is there another pleasure that can rise up within me? Can there be a greater desire? And I'm not quite sure how you're understanding how that greater desire comes about, just by recognizing that the lesser pleasure really isn't doing it and therefore looking elsewhere, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a basic level, sex is taken from the Latin word secare, which means to sever or to amputate from the whole. So sex then is this awareness of, I am disconnected from others, and it's part of the way that I go about reconnecting. And so some theologians make a distinction between, sexuality and genitality. That sexuality, we see that expressed like if there's an infant crying in his or her crib, and then the father or mother comes in, that's an expression of sexuality, that this infant is waking up, recognizing that they're disconnected, and their crying, their ache, their longing is part of the way that comfort comes to them. And if we were to bridge that thought of kind of separation with kind of just Paul's use of, whenever he's talking about sin, he's always talking about sin in reference to what it is against. So sin is anti-law, it's anti-righteousness. And so to follow that line of thinking, I would say sexual sin is actually against sin. So this sense of, part of what we have to wake up to in maturity in our lives is to recognize that a lot of the ways that I have sought out self-medicating behavior have actually furthered the original exile that I grew up with. And so I think it's in that sense of, I look back at the debris of my sexual life and I see a lot of shame, I see a lot of failure. I see that, it's not just about self-medicating, it's also about a sense of I'm pursuing judgment within my sexual behavior. And so I think it's in that kind of choice of, I want to do better, but I can't, kind of the classic Romans 7, that we find ourselves split open. And really, I think that's part of the test of God, is to be able to say, what do you actually want? And I think for so many people that ache and long for healing, they recognize that sexual brokenness, porn, affairs are not where the deepest desires of their heart are found. That thirst, that ache can only be found in the God of the universe. And so I think that's what it means to outgrow our unwanted sexual behaviors and kind of just, in some ways, our earthly desires, is to recognize that we actually want something so much more than some of the cheap counterfeits that we're pursuing in our life.
So the recognition releases a deeper thirst. The recognition of what I'm really living for that isn't doing its job.
I think that's right.
That is pointless. It's an enemy against joy. It's an enemy against all that God is for us. And that releases a deeper thirst, which is one of the major points that I feel is important. I talk about living thirsty, and I'm not talking about living thirsty for pornography or sexual addiction, which works wonderfully for a season. But looking back on it, it doesn't do a darn thing for us. It actually messes up our relationships, of course. And it really also, it seems to me, that the whole problem with sexual addiction really leads to all sorts of relational sin. And that's a big word that I've come up with over the past couple of years, that I really do like J.I. Packer's definition of sin, that it's an anti-God virus. And it really is a pro-Satan virus, if you want to put it more extremely. And when I come to realize that what I'm really doing is ruining my relationships, keeping me from really enjoying my wife properly and being there for my children, my friends, whatever, then it's at that point you're suggesting that a deeper thirst I maybe can get in touch with, a thirst for relational holiness, a thirst for being able to relate to others the way Jesus related to people, which is putting Christ on display by how we relate, which to me is relational holiness. And so you are saying, I think then, and I appreciate it, that the recognition of all this does lead to a realization that there's a deeper thirst that I long to satisfy. But then I come up against the fact that I really agree with C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity when he says we have an inconsolable longing. And that's why the subtitle to my book is The Incurable Addiction to Self. So are you suggesting that there's going to be a final cure before heaven?
No. I think part of what I've had to wrestle with is that there is a profound ache. I think that that's what Augustine is getting at, is like our hearts are restless until we find our rest in him. And so, I think we have the first fruits. We have something of satisfaction. I think in your book too, you mentioned towards the end, the last chapter, that there are hours that are full of glory, that are full of deep satisfaction in God alone. And then emails start. starts. And then distance learning begins with our kids, and we begin to go back to our old patterns. And so I think that that's what, I would say most of our crises, most of the difficulties in our life are the formative crucibles that God is using to begin to invite us to a deeper gladness, a deeper joy, a deeper satisfaction in him. And so I think, throughout the Old Testament, a lot of this is, Marva Dawn's insight, but God shows up, God tabernacles in places of weakness throughout human history. And so I think that when we look at our own weakness, when we look at the debris of the heartache in our life and the harm that we have caused, the sins that have been done against us, the sins that we have harmed other people with, I think if we're really recognizing that, there's a lot of grief in there. There's a lot of shame in that. And I think that's the invitation to the cross is, come unto me, all you who are weary, heavy laden, come unto me, all you who see a lot of just the sorrow and the debris of the heartache that your sin has caused, and I will offer you rest and forgiveness. And so I think, that's the deeply kind invitation of the gospel that we hear in Romans 2:4, that, do you not know that it is the kindness of God that leads to change? And so to me, that's really where I think people that I've seen change the most is they're not trying to just kill and assassinate their sexual brokenness. They're actually understanding how sexual brokenness served them throughout their life. And then they're beginning to get a sense of there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of trauma in their life. And as they begin to pursue their brokenness, their addictions with kindness, that's really where repentance fully begins. And so I think, just that sense of what is repentance? Repentance isn't just this kind of feeling like crap about yourself. It's turning to a party. It's turning to the reality that the God of the universe actually wants to serve me. God gets down on God's knees to offer his body, his blood to me. And so I think when we have an encounter like that, where the worst of me is experienced, I'm deep in my own shame, and yet there is a God who wants to move graciously, hospitably, courageously towards me. If I'm honest, I don't want that. I don't want to be seen in my shame. I don't want to be encountered like that. But I think when we look at communion, the Lord's Supper, that's the invitation, is God's kindness moving towards us, inviting us to a different story, a better story than we came up with in exile.
And God sometimes surprises us with some incredible experiences. Let me just take a minute to tell you a quick story. I was diagnosed with leukemia a couple of years ago, and that meant 33 days in the hospital. Rather happily, my leukemia was the kind they can cure, and I was glad my initial doctor told me that. But after 33 days in the hospital and 8 months of chemotherapy, my leukemia is gone. But here's the point of the story. During those 33 days in the hospital, which I wouldn't ever suggest would be a wonderful opportunity to know the joy of Jesus. Hospital food, being pricked all the time, being loaded with arsenic in my body, which they used to kill rats as well as to cure my cancer. And for whatever reason, and I didn't even ask this of the Lord, but for whatever reason, I would claim, and I think without hesitation, to say that I knew the joy of the Lord for those 33 days. And my sense was my awful experience didn't get in the way of joy. And the word for joy in the Greek is chara, which means a joy that's entirely dependent on the character of God and the promise that he's made to always be doing us good. And even in the hospital, I was very aware of that. And I believe that even during those difficult days, when maybe I was thinking, I don't like being here, let's see if I can maybe conjure a sexual fantasy to put me to sleep. That obviously occurred to me. I'm an old man, but I still can think like that. And I just didn't, because it just seemed like a replacement for the joy that God was giving me. Now, am I claiming perfect joy ever since those days? Not quite. But I am claiming a residual, that there is a deeper thirst within me that makes sexual fantasy or whatever else I might be tempted, like 2 pieces of chocolate cake or whatever. There's just a different level of wanting that I have to put off for its full satisfaction, but it can be meaningful satisfaction, which can help stem the tide of temptation. So is that in line with your thinking, or is that?
Oh yeah, that's so well said, Larry. Yeah.
Yeah, that means a great deal to me because I've really, I don't want to just be a whiner here, but I've got some problems. I've got neuropathy
Raise
now.
your hand if you have problems.
Yeah, I got gastronoma, another kind of cancer. I've got diabetes now, just got diagnosed a couple of days ago. And I'm really believing that there's nothing is going to, I don't believe God caused any of that. God doesn't hate me. He's not trying to make me sick. But I'm living in a fallen world, and that's where I have to live until I go home. And in fallen world, there are car accidents, there's leukemia, there's diabetes, there's all sorts of stuff. But is God always on duty to be doing something in my soul that can relieve me from the power of addiction? And I do believe that.
Yeah, and I think that's the point is, why I'm so passionate about people understanding how they became bonded to porn is that a lot of times that's not your original choice. For a lot of the clients that I worked with, like thinking of one client whose father had one of those black boxes in his basement. And it was basically a descrambler device that gave the whole family access to porn. And so from age 10 on, he was able to watch just about any erotic content. And that was part of what the story that was given to him by his dad, which is, when you want to escape from life, you go down into the basement. Well, guess what happened 20 years later when he was in a marriage? Well, anytime life got difficult, he found himself back in the basement looking at porn on his iPhone. And so I think that's what God is inviting us into is are you aware of the story that got you into sexual brokenness? And if we can begin to understand how that story got hijacked early on for a lot of us, I think of sexual abuse, I think of just a lot of the trauma that all of us have gone in some ways, we are very loyal to a past trauma story, and that is going to hijack our ability to live into the greater story. And so I think as you talked about being in the hospital, when you're aware of suffering, when people are aware of heartache and sin and betrayal in their life, I think that's where they begin to serve the gospel story. So if we looked at just Holy Week, like Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday, Thursday is a day of betrayal. Friday is a day of crucifixion. Saturday is a day of hell. The evangelical church doesn't have much of a notion of what hell is all about. And then Sunday, Easter Sunday. And so all of our stories, what does my suffering do? Well, I think it actually serves the crucifixion. So when I actually incarnate myself back into stories of heartache, places of my own abuse, places of my own struggle, what am I doing? Well, I think I'm making known something of the cross. When I give lament, when I give a sense of, I don't know if resurrection is going to come to my life today. Well, what am I serving? I'm actually serving Holy Saturday. I'm making known something of what God has done on our behalf to enter the ultimate sin and death. And so I think that's the invitation that I think God is saying is, are you aware of this other story that you were brought into? Maybe your family system was really toxic. Maybe you began to pursue infidelity in the midst of the heartache of a marriage. But if you can begin to understand and recognize how those addictions served you and some of the heartache within them, then you'll be able to transition into really serving the gospel story and living into that gospel story and recognizing what the God of the universe might have for you as a really important character in this drama that he's writing.
So the word awareness is a very big word in your thinking.
It is, yeah.
And I gather that you're saying, and I agree with it, that if this can be called an awareness model, not to make it too simplistic, but if this really is an awareness issue, then awareness can lead to repentance, as you define it, not simply, oh, I'm so sorry, I won't do it again, obviously not that. And I'm wondering too, I'm really big on New Covenant theology, this very aware that I have a new heart. And if I'm a Christian, at the very core of my soul, I might not be touching into it, or might even be believing it very much, that the Holy Spirit is living in me. And tell me the role of the Holy Spirit in all of this. What is he up to in the middle of this approach to overcoming temptation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Spirit convicts us. The Spirit is able to kind of, I mean, I think that's where we know when we are. Let me back up a little bit. So, when we think about the notion of shame within sexual addiction, I think shame is both something that we feel in response to pursuing unwanted sexual behavior, but throughout the Bible, shame is also in reference to what you've put your trust in. And that's something that we don't talk about enough these days. But this notion of, if I know that I'm putting my trust in porn or an affair or some other type of addictive behavior, I know that that can't really come through for me. And so in the midst of my shame of realizing that I've trusted in something outside of the God of the universe, I think the Spirit beckons us, it woos us to be able to recognize that, again, we have forgiveness, we have repentance in the midst of that. And so I think the Spirit is always helping us to be able to get a sense of, do you see the beauty of Jesus? Do you see the beauty of the story that you've been invited into? And I think that's where we have to grapple. Is I look back, and I've said it a couple times, but we see a lot of debris of sexual sin in our life, or we also see something of the goodness and beauty and glory of God. And that's what I think the Spirit is helping us to will, to be able to merge more of our life with goodness, with glory, with beauty, with truth.
Both to will and to do of his good pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I continually am puzzled about, and here I am, an old man, is still puzzled about more that I'm clear on, in some ways. But, I think about the fruit of the Spirit, the love, joy, peace, the list of 9 elements of the fruit of the Spirit. And my take on that, I suppose, is rather incomplete. But I see the Spirit saying, you were born to love. You were born to live loved, and you were born to live to love. And that's the core of your soul. And when I stay out of touch with that, then I'm still manipulating my wife to get from her what I think I ought to get. And when she does it, I get mad at her.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not the fruit of the Spirit. And love, joy, depending on God's character, and peace even in the middle of leukemia, peace even in the middle of a spouse leaving me, or a child committing suicide, all these terrible stories we hear. Is there really a peace that passes understanding? And what I think that means is that beneath the hardships of life that continue, and the pain that continues, there really is a peace that doesn't make any sense to us, but it's there. Mm-hmm. And Jeff would not mind me sharing with you that his wonderful wife, who we love very deeply, she's struggling with a rather serious form of cancer now. And as much as we're grieving over that, there's something about the word peace that is coming alive to me, knowing that God is doing good in her soul. And I wish he'd cure her. I really do. He could, and he hasn't so far, and he might not. But that doesn't mean I can't enjoy the peace of the Lord in the middle of real heartache and all the rest of the fruit of the Spirit. And I want to know more of what that means. I know a little of it, but I want to know more of what that means. And I think you're aiming us in that direction, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, I want to know more of that as well. And I think, I think it was Jonathan Edwards that said, the fruit of the Spirit, I mean, it's one fruit. The fruits of the Spirit are all concatenated. They're all connected. So I can't say that I have love if I don't have patience. I can't say I have patience if I don't have joy. And so that sense of like all of these things are actually working together. And I think that that's part of the humility in the Christian life, is to be able to say, I'm not a man. I know my kids transitioned to distance learning this week due to some COVID scares at the school that they're in. And my daughter's 5, and her teacher was doing flashcards, and it was the equation was 20 minus 0 equals what? And my daughter said 20 plus 0. And the teacher corrected her, and she said it again, 20 plus 0. And, my sense of shame in that moment was like, what on earth is going on with me? That my ego, my happiness, my patience is tied into my daughter's academic success in that moment. And so that was a moment for me where I could either try and control it and shame her later on in the day of just kind of drilling her of, you got to get this right. There's no reason to mix up a plus sign versus a minus sign. Or I can say, no, I'm actually not living into the fruit of the Spirit right now. And that was the check for me this morning was, I'm not a man of great patience, love, kindness, self-control. There is a lot in me that needs to change, and I think that's a good window into how I understand addictions and sin. Is it's all of these opportunities to get a sense of where our trust really is not in God, and I think that's where God is wooing us to be able to say, there's a better life. There's a larger story that you could be part of if you were willing to give up and outgrow some of the ways that you have found control and meaning in your present life.
And to realize if you were to have shamed your daughter, which I'm glad you didn't, that would be a bad thing. What you're teaching her, had you shamed your daughter, which I'm sure you didn't, perhaps you did, I don't know.
Well, that's the thing, Larry. I probably would have if I didn't also have an obsession with how people perceive me, and having the teacher be able to kind of feel like, who is this jerk that's going to shame his kindergarten? So if that was not live on Zoom, I probably would have. And that to me was another layer of conviction of, my gosh, there is so much work and maturity left in me.
And had there been shaming, what you're teaching your daughter, had you done that, really would be there's a greater good for you than God. The greater good is as you want to get rid of your shame, that you want to be treated well, and then you're now demanding something that you're not going to get.
Yes.
When you're vulnerable to all sorts of temptations, because I really do believe something I've gotten very aware of in the last, I don't know, about a year or so, is that sin did not begin in the Garden of Eden. Sin began with Lucifer, who decided that there was a greater good than being the supreme angel God created him to be. And because the greater good was to be like God, then he got the whole human race really screwed up, because that's what he got Adam and Eve, the eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And when I walk rather badly now with my neuropathy, I sometimes awkwardly get up and say, my greatest good right now would be to be able to walk normally. But that's not my greatest good. And I cannot demand that. I can, if I really know what it means to wait for heaven, and I agree, I don't know anybody who waits well, I certainly don't, but the degree to which I do wait for heaven releases me to demand nothing now. To not demand God relieve my neuropathy or my cancer or my apnea or my diabetes. God, you're giving me too much. I don't want this anymore. Change it. Be a good God for a change. But then I realized, no. With the cross, he's already proven he's a good God. And I need to say my greatest good, can I put it this way, is to hook up with him. Another phrase for abiding in Christ, I suppose.
Yeah. the 2020 translation. Yeah.
Maybe a rather bad one, I suppose.
The Netflix and chill.
But it really put me in touch with a far deeper thirst. And that's what I mean by living thirsty. The Psalm 47, as the deer pants for water, I pant for the living God. And then the next phrase is, when am I going to go stand before him? So even the psalmist was saying, I can't wait to get out of my smaller story and then live in the larger story in heaven, where my only thirst will be to glorify the Lord and to live properly. And then I don't think sin is going to be impossible in heaven. I think sin is going to be unthinkable, because 1 John says when we see him, we're going to be like him because we know who he is. And that is my part of whatever success I've had in overcoming whatever addictive tendencies I have. I'm a dessert nut, which obviously has something to do with diabetes, I suppose.
And a good coffee fan, from what I could tell as well.
Well, that's only godly.
Yeah. When I hear you talk, Larry, I mean, and especially hearing just what your family has been cornered with health-wise, man, it's just the phrase that came up to me was just like, he's a man of sorrow. All of these difficulties, the way that his body is breaking down. And so just that window again into like Isaiah 53, that, this is a man of sorrows. And then that, being in the Garden of Gethsemane, of saying like, I don't want this. I really don't. If there's any way to have this cup, but nevertheless, your will be done. And I feel like that's part of your integrity and humility, is to be able to wrestle with that. And I think that that's what it means to live well, is that you are giving us a window into Gethsemane, even as you live now. And so just that sense of it's deeply biblical to lament, to cry out, to say, I don't want this. And then to also wait and to surrender. That, I think that's, you're serving Gethsemane right now.
Well, I appreciate that very much. And I just, I'm working on a new book, and the provisional title is "It's Too Much." Too much trouble. And yet the next chapter I'm writing is going to be on our Lord's Gethsemane experience, when he was obviously lamenting and setting. What the most interesting thing about that, Luke is the only one who mentions that the angel came to strengthen him. And after he was strengthened, that's when he shed great drops of blood. The strengthening released him to lament even more deeply, which I think put him in touch even more strongly with the deepest thirst of his soul, which was to obey his Father, who he loved very much and who he knew the Father loved him. And then he stood up and went to the soldiers and went ahead and got himself crucified. And I look at that and I say, he's the one I want to follow. He's the one.
Yeah.
If he's the man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, then I have no right to say I'm not until heaven.
Yeah. Guys, we could go on probably for a long time with this conversation, and I'm really enjoying it, and grateful that we had the opportunity. And it's interesting, Jay, as I hear you talk, I see a lot of overlap in a lot of what Larry talks about as well in respect to brokenness and repentance, and with hard times really opening up an opportunity to know God in a new way and understand what really is prayer all about and all that stuff. So we've been through a lot of it for sure, but we've gotten a bunch of questions, and I don't think we're going to have time to hit all of them. So I'm just going to grab a few here and throw them at both you guys. But Jay, we'll throw these at you first.
Pick an easy one, Kep.
What's that?
Pick an easy one.
I don't think there's any easy ones here. How do you help people who have become so numb by the shame cycle that they aren't listening to the Spirit's conviction and can only hear more shame and condemnation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big point within addiction, is that addiction is not just self-medicating behavior. Addiction is also that sense of I'm pursuing behaviors that actually fill me with greater judgment. And so I think part of the point that we have to do is we have to turn and face our shame. So one of the examples that I use in my book and with a lot of the clients is what I've found in kind of reading some of this is that people who spend a lot of time with great white sharks, so spearfishers, cameramen, Andy Casagrande was interviewed a couple years ago. He's the videographer of the show Shark Week. And so what he said is that, they asked him, what in the world do you do when you're swimming in the waters with a great white shark? And what he says is it's really counterintuitive, but you swim at the shark. You swim in the direction of this great white shark. And he says that if you do not act like prey, they will not treat you like prey. And I think that's a really good insight into just a lot of us who are numbed into shame, is that we actually have not really turned to face our shame. We haven't articulated some of maybe formative stories of abuse or heartache. We haven't really turned to face our own sexual fantasies. And I think when we turn and face our shame, that is what begins to disempower some of the power of shame in our lives. And so I think we have to turn and face a lot of the difficult realities in our life. I know, like when Moses, was pleading on behalf of the people of Israel who had just been, they're being eaten by poisonous snakes. They're being poisoned, and God's remedy to Moses is basically put a snake on a flagpole and raise it up. And when people look at this bronze snake, they're going to be healed. And I think the allegory is pretty simple. When we begin to look at the things that are killing us, that's really where we're going to begin the process of change.
Okay. One thing that we had a question on that, and just about your book, Jay, does it address any of the topic of homosexuality or any of those kind of things? Are they covered in your book or in your counseling?
I don't address homosexuality in my book. I stayed with more just kind of unwanted sexual behavior, and that is there a dimension of someone's life that they would say they wish was not part of it. So we have a lot of people in my ministry and kind of working through same-sex attraction and trying to understand, are there origin stories associated with that? How do I kind of walk through a process of repentance with that? But most of my book is about extramarital affairs, buying sex, and pornography, which I would say affects all people. So
yeah. Yeah. Here's another question. Is there a therapeutic model, a form of soul care that your research led you to? And she says, I'm interested that the folks so addicted access healing by going into their fantasy content for clues to original wound. Talk therapy, imagery, prayer, all of the above?
Yeah, I would say that that's part of, I'm a big compiler of different people's work. And so part of what I was trying to do in Unwanted in this kind of the arousal template was I used this example in the online course that I have of inviting people to think about their sexual life as a house. And so just to kind of flow with that analogy, it's late in the evening and you hear that familiar knock of lust. What are you gonna do? Well, some people put a force field around their house, internet monitoring, and they hope that no lust ever comes in. Some people try and call phone a friend for backup. Some people just let the intruder into their house and ransack various rooms. So my approach is, what if you went out onto the front porch and you began to interrogate your life? So interrogate your fantasies. So, just the notion of Romans 12:2, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Well, you can't really renew your sexual mind if you don't really know what's in there. And so I've built upon Dr. Patrick Carnes's notion of the arousal template, which is all of us have an arousal template, which is a constellation of images, thoughts, sensations, times of day, relational archetypes that we all find arousing. And every one of those fantasies actually has something to teach us. And so another mentor of mine is Dan Allender. And so I have learned a lot about just kind of narrative work, story work from that. And so I would say a lot of my work is this kind of compilation of just a lot of people work who's come before me, where how do we bridge in this notion of the arousal template, but also knowing that our arousal is actually it's a very storied process, that when I've overcome a lot of my own sexual brokenness, my involvement with pornography, understanding the story that got me to my sexual brokenness and the fantasies that I was pursuing in my pornography life and sexual fantasy life, that was really, to kind of go back to Larry's word, the awareness of what story I was playing out really, really helped transform my life. So, yeah.
And here's a question I want to ask. How important is it in your mind for someone to share all the difficulties in their past and all the wounds that they have? I have two questions here. One, with more than a therapist, but maybe with a spouse or a friend, is transparency required outside of the therapy room? Question one, maybe that's the only question.
My goodness, yes, I hope so. I mean, if you're, I think part of what therapy has done for me is help give me language that, outside of Zoom or a selfie or a mirror, I can't see my face. I need other people. And so, some of my early work with a therapist when I was in grad school really helped me to see what I could not see on my own. And so I would say that gave me the experience of what it meant to be really held well by another human being. And what was the process of kind of understanding some of my story. So as I've gotten into, like, my wife knows my arousal template. It's not something that I just recommend that level of transparency right away, but I think of, I'm in New York City right now, which has scaffolding everywhere. So that sense of, if you want to go higher up onto a building and have higher levels of conversation, great. But you've got to have the scaffolding in place. And so for my wife to know some of the heartache in my childhood, to know the role that I played in my family. My dad was a pastor. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. That sense of my dad being, pursuing a lot of his pastoral duties left me on the hook to care a lot for my mom. I was really good at doing that. But that care that I had for my mom, that insight into her heartache, her difficulties, also got woven into my sexual life and my sexual fantasy world. And so that's the scaffolding that I bring to my wife. I'm not just someone who looked at mother, I'd like to F porn randomly. That sense of that story had to go somewhere. And so for my wife to kind of know, here's part of the building blocks of my addiction and my compulsivity. It's not about you. It's not about you being not enough. It's not about you being not attractive. All the lies that most spouses believe. I had to really get a sense of my story. And so I'll come back to your question, Larry. No, it's not enough. I don't think that I would ever want someone to just feel like they have a friend and a therapist, but they're not walking deeply, intimately with other men and women in their spouses. I think the therapeutic context creates a place for people to understand a little bit more, but I think the life and process of godliness and community and really living outside of just my story, but getting a sense of what's the wider story in my community, how do I love others, that gets lived out in our church, that gets lived out in our marriage, that gets lived out with our neighbors.
Or at least it should. One other quick thought. I'm very taken by 1 Peter 5, where he talks about God heals, but the next phrase is not our wounds. The next phrase is our waywardness.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to see how that, we don't have time to discuss it now, but that's a very important concept to me. I think that we have become obsessed a little over much, if I might say, with saying, I want my wound healed, as opposed to there's something far more deadly within me than my wound, and that's my waywardness.
Yes.
And I need to bring the word sin very powerfully into the topic.
Mm-hmm.
And without that, then I think we're really missing the whole point of the cross.
Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well, but I totally agree. I mean, I think we all have to reckon with the reality that Jesus has scars. Jesus could have eliminated his wounds, but he left them. And so what does that mean for me, for you, of like, I can't just try and pursue, I'm just going to heal, I'm going to get rid of all my wounds, because our wounds actually tell a story. They make known the crucifixion. They make known something greater than myself.
They're useful.
And so, they're useful. And so that sense of my waywardness, I mean, that's part of what sin is being wayward. It's not living into the story that God has wanted. It's a relational term in terms of sin. And so the waywardness needs to be addressed. And then as we turn back, that's really where we experience healing.
Well, I sure know that when we used to be in private practice for about 10 years, and even when I still counsel people, which I still do some, I'm repenting about 20 times an hour because I find myself thinking of something really, really smart that I can't wait to tell them, so they'll be impressed they got Dr. Crabb. And then they got to say, oh, Larry, get off yourself. Why don't you reveal Jesus for a change? And that's my repentance about 20 times during a counseling hour.
Well, guys, I don't want to cut this short, but I don't think we're doing that. I think we're going. We've actually had some requests if we can do a part 2 follow-up to this. So I'd like to wrap now. First of all, Jay, thanks so much for joining us today, man. This has been really
my goodness. This has been so fun. Thank you for having me.
We'd love to have you again. We've got a lot of people that said, can we do this again and have part 2 to this conversation? I've got a bunch of questions that we didn't get to, but that's okay. And I just wanted to say thanks. Guys, you can see on the screen, you've got Jay's book up there, Unwanted, How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing. You can get that on Amazon. We encourage you to. Jay, one other question. One guy said real quickly, he wants to buy your book in bulk. Can you give him a discount in bulk? So I let him know, but wants to give it to a lot of people. So
that's kind.
Again, and Jay, thanks for joining us. So and everybody, thanks for joining us as well. We're going to wrap up now. Just want to remind everyone that on December 18th, Larry will be doing his the 3rd session on the 7 churches of Revelation, the church on trial. So we urge you to join that. And we just want to again thanks Jay Stringer for joining us. Dad, always great to see you. And everybody have a safe and happy holiday. We'll see you soon. Thanks.